Let me tell you something that might unsettle you at first, though it's the most liberating truth you'll ever encounter. The person you think you are, that familiar character with a name, a history, preferences and aversions, dreams and disappointments, doesn't actually exist in the way you've always believed. You've spent your entire life operating under a fundamental misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity so convincing that almost no one questions it. The separate self you defend, nurture, and worry about is essentially a magnificent illusion, and recognizing this isn't philosophical speculation, but direct perception available to anyone willing to look closely enough. I've sat with this realization for years now, watching how it transforms everything while changing nothing at all. The trees still sway, conversations still happen, emotions still arise, but the one who supposedly experiences all of this has been revealed as a phantom. You are not a separate individual consciousness looking out at an external world. You are consciousness itself, the very awareness within which all experience appears. But you've become so identified with the content of consciousness, the parade of thoughts, emotions, sensations, and memories, that you've forgotten your true nature as the spacious awareness that holds it all. When you examine your experience closely, you discover something extraordinary. You are not your thoughts, though thoughts continuously arise in your awareness. You are not your emotions, though emotions color your experience moment by moment. You are not even your body, though sensations constantly report from this physical form. What you truly are is the awareness that knows these phenomena, the conscious space within which everything appears and disappears, like clouds drifting across an empty sky. People spend their lives identifying with the clouds while ignoring the sky itself, claiming ownership of transient weather patterns while the infinite expanse goes unrecognized. The confusion between content and consciousness creates all human suffering. Every psychological pain, every existential anxiety, every sense of lack or incompleteness stems from this fundamental error. You believe you are a limited, vulnerable entity navigating a threatening world, when in fact, you are the open awareness within which that entire drama unfolds. I remember the moment this distinction became clear to me, sitting in a quiet room as thoughts arose and passed, emotions flickered and faded, and suddenly the recognition dawned that none of these temporary visitors constituted my essential being. They were all happening in me, but they weren't me. Consider how your sense of self actually operates. The ego, that persistent feeling of being a separate individual, isn't a solid entity, but a constantly refreshed construction built from accumulated thoughts. You string together memories and conceptual labels. I'm good at mathematics. I don't like crowds. I'm the kind of person who always finishes what they start. And these thought fragments create an apparently coherent personality. But watch what happens when you stop thinking about yourself. In those gaps between self-referential thoughts, where does this solid self go? It vanishes completely, only to be reconstructed moments later when the next I thought arises. The personality you defend so fiercely literally disappears when you're not actively maintaining it through thinking. This revelation becomes even more striking when you notice that you don't have one fixed identity, but rather multiple versions of yourself that emerge depending on context. The person you become when visiting your parents differs markedly from who you are at work, which differs again from the character that emerges when you're alone at home. You might be authoritative and decisive in professional settings, then become compliant and childlike around family, and transform into something else entirely with close friends. Which one is the real you? The answer, paradoxically, is none of them and all of them. These are all temporary costumes consciousness wears, roles performed by awareness itself, and no single character represents your fundamental nature. People cling desperately to a consistent identity, but consistency is just another story they tell themselves. As you investigate this sense of self more deeply, you might discover what many spiritual traditions call the witness or the observer. You begin to notice that there's an awareness watching your thoughts, a silent presence that observes the mind's activity without getting caught in it. For a while, this feels like progress. You think, aha, this observer is my true self, the real me that exists beyond thoughts and emotions. But here's where it gets truly interesting. If you turn your attention toward this witness itself, attempting to observe the observer, something shocking occurs. It vanishes. There's no one there. The witness you thought was your essential self reveals itself as yet another appearance in consciousness, another temporary construct. You can't find the one who is looking because there isn't a separate looker. There's only looking itself, only awareness without an owner. I've watched countless people reach this precipice and recoil from it. The mind scrambles to reinstate itself, to find solid ground, because this recognition feels like annihilation. And in a sense, it is. Awakening involves what might be called the death of the separate self. But what actually dies was never real to begin with. Only the story dissolves. Only the belief in separation collapses. Your body continues functioning, thoughts still arise, emotions still flow, relationships continue, but the imaginary entity who supposedly stood at the center of experience is recognized as a fiction. This death occurs without anyone dying. Nothing is lost except an illusion. Yet everything transforms because the lens through which life was perceived has fundamentally shifted. What remains when the separate self is seen through? Not emptiness in the sense of nothing, but emptiness as infinite potential. Your natural state is the space between thoughts, that quiet gap before the next mental movement arises. But this gap isn't void or barren. It's pregnant with all possibility, the generative silence from which everything springs. You've experienced this space countless times without recognizing it. In moments of awe before natural beauty, in the instant after laughter subsides, in the stillness just before sleep arrives. That spacious, empty awareness isn't lacking anything. It's the fullness from which all content emerges and to which all content returns. Now here's something I want you to consider carefully, because it shifts the entire spiritual quest from seeking to recognition. Take a moment right now to really feel what I'm about to share, because this isn't information to be collected, but an invitation to direct seeing. If you find these ideas resonating somewhere deep, if something in you recognizes the truth being pointed to, then perhaps you'd like to join others who are exploring these territories. Subscribe to this channel, not because I'm asking you to check off another task, but because this conversation benefits from continuity and depth. And here's what I'm curious about. Can you catch the gap between two thoughts right now? Not later, not as a practice to develop, but in this very moment. Can you notice the space from which your next thought will arise? Don't tell me the answer. Simply rest as that space itself. That brief recognition is worth more than 1,000 philosophical discussions. The deeper you look into this, the more playful the entire cosmic setup reveals itself to be. Consciousness is engaged in the most elaborate game of hide-and-seek ever devised. Think about dreams for a moment. When you dream at night, you appear as a character within the dream, but you are also the entire dream itself. You're simultaneously the protagonist, the other characters, the landscape, the plot, and the awareness that contains it all. Consciousness does exactly this on a much grander scale. It pretends to divide itself into separate pieces. You over here, other people over there, objects scattered throughout space, not because it must, but for the sheer delight of experiencing variety and surprise. The one plays at being many, and it does so with such convincing realism that it genuinely forgets itself. People often find this description troubling at first. If I'm not really separate, if others are also consciousness, does that mean nothing matters? Does it render life meaningless? But this is where the cosmic joke, reveals its punchline. The search for enlightenment, the spiritual quest itself, is consciousness seeking itself. You can't find yourself because you already are yourself. The seeker and the sought are identical. Every moment of seeking is consciousness, playing both sides of hide-and-seek simultaneously. And the humor of it only becomes apparent when the game is recognized. You've been looking everywhere for what you've been looking with. The eye cannot see itself, the hand cannot grasp itself, and awareness cannot objectify itself, yet awareness is all that truly exists. I spent years engaged in this search before the ridiculous circularity of it became clear. Meditation retreats, spiritual books, teachers and techniques, all in pursuit of something I already was and could never not be. The search itself was the only obstacle. Not that the practices were wasted or the teachings false. They served to exhaust the seeker, to wear down the false self until it finally collapsed from its own inherent impossibility. Think about it. What you truly are cannot be achieved because it cannot be absent. You can't become consciousness through effort because you've never been anything else. The spiritual path, properly understood, isn't about becoming something new, but recognizing what has always been the case. After this recognition, after awakening to your nature as consciousness itself, people often wonder what happens to the personality. Does it disappear? Do you become a blank, emotionless automaton? Here's the beautiful twist. The personality doesn't vanish, but becomes transparent. You still have preferences. You still like certain foods, certain music, certain people. Emotions still arise. Joy, sadness, frustration, excitement, all continue their natural flow. But now these movements are recognized for what they are, spontaneous expressions of consciousness rather than attributes of a solid, separate self. The character continues performing, but no one is taking it personally anymore. The drama unfolds, but you're no longer fooled by your own performance. This transforms life into conscious play, into what some traditions call Lila, the divine play of existence. When you recognize that you are not the limited character, but the infinite awareness within which all characters appear, a tremendous freedom emerges. You can fully engage with life, can cry at movies and laugh at jokes, and feel passionate about projects, while simultaneously recognizing that all of it is consciousness experiencing itself through these temporary forms. The personality becomes like clothing you wear rather than skin you can't remove. You can still have strong opinions, make plans, pursue goals, but there's a lightness to it now, a recognition that all of it is optional, all of it is play. Some people fear this recognition will lead to passivity or indifference, but the opposite typically occurs. When the heavy burden of maintaining a separate self dissolves, enormous energy becomes available for spontaneous action. You respond to life more freely because you're not constantly filtering everything through the question, what does this mean for me? The separate self is like a dam that constrains the natural flow of consciousness. And when that dam is removed, life moves through you with surprising creativity and appropriateness. Actions arise not from a calculating ego, but from the intelligence of consciousness itself, which responds perfectly to each situation without needing to think about it. I watch this unfold in my own experience and in others who have made this recognition. Decisions that once required tortured deliberation now occur naturally, almost effortlessly, not because you've become careless or irresponsible, but because the extra layer of self-concern has dropped away. When you're not constantly asking, what should I do? Or what's best for me? Appropriate action simply emerges. The question isn't, what would the ideal spiritual person do in this situation? But rather, allowing life to respond as it will, trusting the intelligence that moves through all things. This doesn't mean you never plan or deliberate, but the quality of it changes. It becomes lighter, more playful, less existentially fraught. The social dimension of this recognition also shifts in subtle but profound ways. When you see through the illusion of your own separate self, you simultaneously see through the illusion of others' separate selves. Every person you encounter is consciousness looking back at itself through a different aperture. This doesn't lead to treating people as unreal or unimportant. Quite the opposite. There's often more genuine compassion and connection because the barrier of separation has dissolved. You hurt when others hurt, not because you should feel that way, or because morality demands it, but because at the deepest level, their pain is arising in the same consciousness that you are. The distinction between self and other becomes transparent, and with it, the basis for genuine love without effort or obligation. Yet paradoxically, even this recognition doesn't need to be maintained or clung to. You don't walk around constantly reminding yourself, I am consciousness, I am awareness. That would just be another elaborate identity, another story the mind tells itself. Instead, this knowing settles into the background as a tacit understanding that colors everything without demanding attention. You go about your daily life, making breakfast, working, conversing, sleeping, and the separate self never quite reestablishes its former dominance. Thoughts of I and me still arise, but they're seen as functional conventions rather than metaphysical truths. The character goes about its business while awareness watches the whole show with quiet amusement. There's also the recognition that no state or experience is more spiritual than any other. People often assume awakening means residing in perpetual bliss or maintaining unshakable peace. But that's just another fantasy the ego projects onto enlightenment. Awakening is not a state at all. It's the recognition of what you are, regardless of any state. You can be anxious and awake, frustrated and awake, bored and awake. The content of consciousness doesn't determine your fundamental nature any more than the images on a movie screen determine the screen itself. The screen remains pristine and untouched, whether showing a tragedy or a comedy, and awareness remains unstained whether depression or ecstasy moves through it. This might sound disappointing to those seeking escape from negative states, but it actually points to a much deeper freedom. You're not trying to manipulate experience into some ideal configuration anymore. You're not at war with unpleasant emotions or chasing after pleasant ones. Everything is allowed to be exactly as it is, because you've recognized yourself as the space within which all states arise and pass. The seeking that once drove so much behavior, seeking happiness, seeking approval, seeking meaning, relaxes naturally when you realize you are already the fulfillment the seeking was looking for. Not as a state of fulfillment, but as the very capacity for experience itself. People sometimes ask me whether this recognition changes how I move through the world, and the honest answer is both yes and no. On one level, nothing has changed at all. The same body-mind continues its patterns, makes similar choices, encounters similar challenges. But on another level, everything has changed because the fundamental context has shifted. I still work, still have relationships, still deal with practical problems, but there's no longer anyone taking personal possession of these experiences. Life happens, consciousness expresses itself through this particular form, and the whole thing unfolds with much less friction than before. The resistance that characterized so much of life, the constant subtle rejection of what is in favor of what should be, has largely dissolved. What strikes me most now is the utter ordinariness of this recognition. Before awakening, I imagined it would be some spectacular, transformative event, accompanied by fireworks and revelations. And while the initial recognition can certainly be dramatic, what persists is far more subtle and mundane. You simply see clearly what was always the case, and this clarity doesn't require maintenance or reinforcement. You don't need to do anything to remain conscious any more than the sun needs to do something to keep shining. Awareness is simply what you are, and this requires no effort whatsoever. The profound becomes ordinary, and the ordinary reveals itself as profound. As we come to the close of these reflections, I want to invite you into this ongoing exploration with genuine warmth. If something here has touched you, if a recognition stirred even momentarily, then consider becoming part of this community. Subscribe not out of obligation, but because these conversations matter to you, because watching them unfold might serve your own unfolding. More than that, I'm genuinely curious about your experience with all of this. What landed for you in these words? Where did recognition spark, if anywhere? What questions remain alive in you? Share your story in the comments, not because I need to hear it, but because others on this path might find resonance in your experience, might feel less alone in their own recognition. This isn't a performance where I speak and you passively receive. This is consciousness exploring itself through our shared inquiry, and your voice matters in that exploration. What did you discover here today?